Hey, it's Charlie here. I just got done wiring up AEM version 2 for my 95 Toyota Supra twin turbo. Technically it's a single turbo now. I just wanted to go over how I wired everything up, all the sensors, the locations, the wiring, and even talk about the fuel pump pot wire. So to start, this is everything that I removed from the car. This is the factory ECU. You don't need that when you run AEM. It replaces that box. This is the front O2 sensor. You don't need that either. With AEM, you'll use the wideband sensor to meter everything. My car had some piggyback stuff in it when I bought it. This is all aftermarket stuff. This is an old school HKS VPC and a GCC. And this is a Powder X wideband gauge that's also very old school. I didn't need any of that, so I was able to take it out. That was all the wiring for everything. There was a manual boost controller. I'm going to have AEM control the boost now, so I don't need that. These are just some sensors that went with the old stuff. And this was an old boom sling harness, and this would go between the factory ECU and the factory ECU connectors. So that when you wanted to wire in all of this aftermarket stuff, you could wire in to this and you wouldn't hack up the OEM harness. But all that is removed. I don't need it. I'll be selling it soon. And this is what's going in the car. This is AEM version 2. I bought it brand new. These are all of the sensors. There's the IAT sensor, the boost control solenoid, the map sensor, and this is a wideband controller. I went with a controller versus an actual wideband gauge because I plan on getting the little BTI screen in the near future, and that'll be able to show me anything that the AEM ECU can see. So I'll be able to monitor air-fuel ratio, boost, coolant temp, injector, duty cycle, all that stuff right on a little screen. It'll go where the factory clock was, and I won't need to have several gauges mounted in my car. This bracket system I bought off the Supra forums. There's a guy on there that makes them for people, and it'll bolt into the factory location. And these bolts on top are so that you can mount this little plate, and it'll help protect the wiring, because the passenger feet can push on the carpet that can want to push on this ECU, and you don't want to damage anything. This ECU won't fit under the factory ECU cover. So why did I go with version 2? Version 2, I'm familiar with it. I've used it for the last 7 or 8 years in my 3000 GT that's over there. I have a 94 VR4. And it's worked well. I've never had any issues with it. I love the interface. It's simple. It's not overcomplicated. Does everything I need it to do. So that's the main reason. The other reason is the only other alternative that I was kind of looking at was the Infinity. But that has a stumble issue that a lot of people have ran into, where the car kind of cuts out every now and then, and I didn't want to deal with that. So I went with version 2. Before you start wiring in AEM, I'd recommend printing out the factory wiring diagram. This can be found in the service manual. It's 2 pages, and you have to find where they are in the manual, but once you print them out, you can cut the top off one of the pages and tape it down the center, and then you'll have a view of the entire wiring diagram for the engine. So I've highlighted a few things we'll be talking about. That's the OEM fuel pump controller. This is the front O2 sensor. This is got to be wired up to be the wideband. This is where the Mack Valve is going to be wired into. This is the factory map sensor location. That's sort of be wired in the AEM map sensor. This is the factory mass airflow sensor, and that gets removed from the car. And we're going to be wiring in the IAT sensor to that wiring. And then this down here is the rear O2 sensor. which you don't need with AEM. I'm going to be repurposing one of the low side outputs that went to it to control my fuel pump. So let's talk about the sensors. Down here is where I mounted the air intake temp sensor, right on the intercooler pipe that goes to my throttle body. It'll come with an aluminum bung to weld in. My piping is stainless, so I had to order a stainless bung offline. Anyone else that needs the size, it was 3/8 NPT. So I put it here. Some people will argue that it should go on the air intake. That way it measures the temperature going into the car. But I have a front mount that's going to cool the air down, and other people argue that it's better to have after the intercooler. That way it's measuring the cool air. So that's what I like to do. And I like to mount it down a little bit and to give myself some room. I know some people even mount it on the throttle body or up higher, but I don't want it to get heat soaked at all. And I wanted to give myself room in case I ever decide to spray meth. You wouldn't want to be spraying meth before the air intake sensor. So this gives me about a foot where I could put a meth nozzle on either side if I had to. So the wiring for that is really simple. There's 2 wires that come off it. One goes to B65, one goes to B45, and those ECU locations actually already have wires that run from the ECU over to the mass airflow sensor connector. So there's a pink and blue and a brown and black wire on this connector, and those go back to those ECU locations. So we can tie it in right there. So I've got the wiring for this sensor just kind of runs around underneath the radiator support. It pops out over here, curls around, and then goes right into that connector. I just cut the sleeving back a few inches, cut the wires, and soldered the 2 wires on there. And it doesn't matter which one goes to which wire. It doesn't matter for this sensor. So the next sensor is the map sensor. The Toyota Supra actually has an OEM map sensor on the car. This is what it looks like. I've removed it, I've cut the wiring for it. It would bolt right here on those 2 bolt holes that you see. This sensor is only good up to 18 PSI. So a lot of people that are doing AEM are gonna wanna run more than that. So you're gonna wanna upgrade that sensor. I'm running the AEM 3.5 bar sensor, and I put it in the kind of factory location. You can tap that hole out to be 1/8 NPT to fit this setting. The 3 wires that went to the factory map sensor, you can cut, and you can repin them to use with that sensor. And if you're curious where those wires are and where they go, 1 wire goes to B65 on the ECU, that's the brown with black stripe. That's the signal ground. The sensor power is B41, that's the blue with red stripe. And the actual signal wire that carries the data is 62B, that's the black with yellow stripe wire. So you can repin that sensor, crimp on the AEM. The AEM will come with the actual pins that you need to do it correctly. You need one of these Molex tools. These are about $60, but there's some other brands that are kind of knockoffs that work pretty well for around $20. When considering the map sensor, I went with the 3.5 bar versus the 5 bar. You got to think about how much boost you're going to run. So 1 bar is 14.7 PSI. So 3.5 bars kind of sounds like you'd be able to run 14.7, let's call it 15. So 15, 30, 45, half of 15, 7.5, 52.5 psi is what you'd think you'd be able to run. But really one of those bars is for vacuum. So it's more like a 2.5 bar sensor. So you got 15, 30, 37.5. It's about the boost that gauge will, not the gauge, the sensor will be able to read up to correctly. So that's what I went with. I'm going to be running about 30 psi. That's plenty sufficient for a sensor that can read up to like 37, 38 psi. But if you're going to be running more than that, you're going to want to use the 5 bar sensor. Why not just buy the 5 bar sensor? I believe they're the same price. It's all about the scale. If you buy the 5 bar sensor and you're not using above 37 psi, that's kind of a waste of scale at the upper end. You'll get a better reading when you're utilizing a scale for the whole range versus that wasted space at the top. It'll be more accurate. So that's what I did, and just to show you it one more time, I actually tapped it with the manifold on the car. If you remove the throttle body and you were to look straight in, you'll see there's like a 3-inch shelf where the shavings will drop, and then the runners are to the right of that shelf. So I shoved the towel in there to block off the runners, and I slowly tapped it by hand, and I watched the shavings drop right on that ledge, and then I vacuumed them up. So I didn't have to pull anything because that looks like it would be a pain to pull. The other argument that you'll hear people say is don't mount it directly to the manifold. Engine vibration can cause problems. I've never had an issue with that on my 3000 GT, so that's what I did. Plus the factory one is mounted to the manifold as it is. But if you're one of those people, you could mount it remotely and run some vacuum line to it, put a nipple in the manifold, extend the wiring to reach it. That's always an option. But I think it looks pretty clean right there. The next sensor is the Mack Valve. This is the boost control solenoid. It's sold by a company named Mack. You could buy it directly from them for a lot cheaper. AEM will put their sticker on it and increase the price quite a bit. But that's the actual valve right there. I made a little bracket to mount it. You want to use some kind of rubber isolator bushing, because if you mount it directly to metal, it's got to transfer a lot of noise. There's a valve in there that opens and closes really fast, and you'll actually hear it inside the car. So you want to use some kind of rubber isolator bushing for that. And there's 2 wires that come off that. One of the wires needs to see switched 12 volts, and the other needs to go to pin 60B. And fortunately, that ECU location and a switch 12 volts already exists in the engine bay. It's one of the VSV connectors. It's a blue VSV connector. This is the connector. I cut it off so I could wire it in. And that is down here off of these pigtails. One of them goes to the alternator. I think one of them was the O2 sensor. You can't really see the connector because I cut it off, but it was right off that little tree of pigtails. And for the wiring on that, I didn't want to run it over near my turbo because it probably gets pretty hot there. So I was able to fish the wiring. It actually goes through this grommet, runs underneath here, pops out here, and then goes right where it needs to. I just used like a coat hanger and kind of pushed it through there till I could feel it, and then taped it on and pulled it through. That way it's protected from heat. I don't have to worry about it, and it makes it pretty clean. I don't end up with like a line running across here. So I had mentioned earlier that the factory O2 sensor can be removed. This is where the front one is. I've already removed it and I've got this block off plate installed there. I purchased that off eBay. I think it was $35 shipped. It's made of stainless. Probably a little bit overpriced for what it is, but it's a lot easier than trying to mock one up yourself. This is the wideband sensor for the controller that I'm using. And that goes right through the same opening and goes into the cabin. There's a connector I have tucked in here to undo it. And that wiring is pretty simple. There's only 3 wires that you need to worry about. There's a red switched power, a black ground, and then there's different outputs depending on what kind of signal that you want. AEM wants a 0 to 5 volt signal, so that's the white wire that comes off of the sensor, and that will go to pin 47B, which is the air-fuel ratio number 1 location on the AEM ECU. On the stock ECU, that would be the front O2 sensor. So technically, you could wire it into where the front O2 sensor plug is in the engine bay, but you'd have to also find a switch power out here and a ground, and the harness that comes off of the sensor is about 10 feet long, and that's a lot of wiring to actually hide in the engine bay. Let me just show you. Maybe it's even longer than 10 feet. Yeah, probably. This is the other end of that sensor. When you tap into the wire, you want to tap into it after this box. You don't want to tap or even touch any of the wiring before there. There's a resistor and stuff in here that's been calibrated for their sensor, so you don't want to interfere with it by trying to solder anything above there. So you'll want to tap into the white wire here, and what I'm going to do is, those are the ECU connectors. I'm going to find the wire, I'm going to snip it back about 5 inches, and then I'll tap the white wire into it, and if for some reason I ever needed to undo it, I just have to reattach the one OEM wire there. So that covers the wiring for all of the main sensors for AEM. If you look at the wiring diagram, it'll show you the actual ECU connector here. It'll tell you all of the connector information. You've heard me say B62, A15, etc. Those are what the pin locations were that I was referencing in the AEM manual. It'll tell you what each pin location does. I kind of put some asterisks next to the ones that I'm using. It's a good idea to double check too. So I like to use a multimeter. This is a multimeter. So you can turn it to this audible setting, press this, then anytime the actual leads touch, it'll beep. So if you've got a wire under the pin or under the hood and you think this goes to pin B45 where the ECU is, you can gator clip this under the hood to that connector, and you can touch the other one inside the car, and if you hear the beep, you'll know that that wire goes to where you think it does. So now I want to talk about the actual fuel pump in my car, or fuel pumps rather. This has 2 Supra OEM fuel pumps that are installed. It came that way when I bought it. One of the fuel pumps uses the main feed location, and the second uses this AN fitting that someone tapped into the top of it. And it was all powered by some 8-gauge wiring. I think I have it right here. Yeah. So this is the power wire that was going to both of those fuel pumps. I replaced it, upgraded it. This is just cheap aluminum wire. I'm not a fan of it. I like to use the oxygen-free stuff. And it was kind of borderline on the small side as it was. So to calculate what size wire you need to get kind of a flow chart for the fuel pump that you're dealing with. So this right here is for the AEM Supra fuel pump. I found it online. Over here is the PSI for the fuel pump. So base fuel pressure is usually 43.7. Let's call it 45. So at base fuel pressure, using 15.5 amps. This car is going to see around 30 psi. So when the fuel pressure regulator sees me running at full boost, that's going to bump up 30 more psi. So 45 plus 30 is 75. So that fuel pump is going to pull 17 amps, potentially even a little bit more if I go above 30 psi, or if my alternator outputs more. This test was done at 13.5 volts. Who knows, my alternator may output like 13.6 or 13.7. So I like to add a little bit just to be safe, call it 18 or 19 amps, and that's for one fuel pump. So I have two of them, so I need to double that. If it's 19 amps per fuel pump and you double that, it's 38 amps that it's going to be pulling. So there's different wire sizing charts online. I've looked at quite a few of them, and there's actually some variation, which is kind of crazy. You'd think they'd have one chart for everything. But if we go about 12 feet in wiring, and I just said it's going to be 38 amps, which is about 40 amps right here, is what you would need, and it's kind of on the edge of being between 8 and 6 gauge. So this aluminum wire was on the edge, and it's kind of cheap wire to begin with. A lot of the cheap wire like this is undersized. It's not a real true gauge, and it doesn't work as well. So I'm doing mine with some quality wire. This is oxygen-free copper. You can tell that it's copper because, one, it looks like copper. Two, it's not the fake copper, that CCA stuff, which is aluminum wire that's coated with copper, because when you cut it, you don't see any silver in the strands here. The other way you can tell is just by weight. It's pretty heavy. And kind of the final way to tell is how much you pay for it. This stuff costs a lot more than the aluminum wire. So my fuel pump is said it could be 8 or 6 gauge. I like to always do a little bit of overkill. So I'm running 4 gauge to the back. And this is how I did it. So here's my battery. I crimped on some 0.1 gauge wire that runs right over here to this kicker distribution / fuse block. So this has 2 fuses in it. There's 2 4 gauge outputs. One of them is going to my amp underneath the passenger seat, and the other is going back to the fuel pump. I do plan to get some wire loom to cover this red wire. It's pretty heavy duty as it is, but I want some extra protection. The wire loom I have wasn't thick enough, so I think some 3/4 loom would work. But that feeds into the car, runs down underneath my carpet, goes out under this panel, and then comes into the trunk. It's right here. I put some loom on it. It goes to my relay. And this is a nice relay. It's a Tyco relay. It's rated for 75 amps, which is plenty. You recall 38 amps is what both fuel pumps would pull running on full boost. and this can handle it. A lot of the cheap little square amps that you get at an auto parts store are only rated for 15 amps. So if you're using 2 of those, one for each fuel pump, or even worse, one for both, that's scary. You don't want to burn your car down or anything. So I'd recommend getting a quality amp or a quality relay. And then the 4 gauge goes into that, it outputs. I wire it here into some 8 gauge wire, and that goes down here, and that's where I tie into the factory wiring. So on the connector that provides everything to the fuel pump assembly, there's several wires. The 2 thick ones are power and ground for the single fuel pump. So what a lot of people do is they'll repurpose that ground wire and make it power to the second fuel pump, and then they'll add a lug to the top of the assembly, and that will be the ground for everything, because you want to use the thickest wires that you can for both fuel pumps. So repurposing that ground gives you exactly what you need. This is more of that kind of cheap wire that I don't like. I am going to replace that with some 4 gauge oxygen-free copper wire like I have. I just didn't want to use what I have because it's red, and I'm going to get some black wire and use that just so I don't have red wire acting as a ground. To make all of the connectors, you can make some really nice connections online. I got this tool. I'm very happy with it. It's really fun to use, but it's a nice tool for crimping everything together. So I showed you how I'm getting power to the fuel pump relay, but I wanted to talk about actually triggering it. So the factory Supra system has a fuel pump controller in the car, and I don't have that. It didn't come with the car, someone removed it. But it normally bolts behind here, the relay connection. You can actually see the connector for it if you look close in the back there, wiggling around. That was the connector. It would plug into the fuel pump controller. And the way it worked is when you turn the ignition on, power would come through this EFI relay. It would go to the fuel pump controller. And then depending what the car is doing, this fuel pump control wire would tell it, do I need to send 12 volts or less to the fuel pump? So if you're idling, it wasn't running at a full 12 volts. It made it easier on the fuel pump, I guess. Subarus do this a lot. Toyotas, I guess, do it as well. And I don't have this anymore. So when people bypass this, they'll usually connect this blue with orange stripe wire to this blue with red stripe wire, and it make a very good diagonal there, right? And that's how a lot of people will bypass it, which is fine. So now that I have that relay in there, I'm going to use this blue with orange wire to give me power to the relay trigger, and then I'm going to use AEM to ground the other side. And that's exactly how they recommend doing it in the actual manual. So this is the manual. Right here on fuel pump control, they'll tell you that if you're using the OEM controller, which I'm not, you can use pin 22A to vary the voltage to that to signal if you want the car to run the fuel pump at 9 volts or 12 volts. And they'll warn you, warning, do not use pin 22A to control a fuel pump relay directly. Must be connected to the OEM fuel pump ECU only. If an aftermarket fuel pump relay will be installed, which I'm using, they recommend using a low side output, and they did LS9, for example, which is pin 68B. So they tell you can use 68B, which is right here, it had no use on the stock ECU, and it's switched ground. And that was my original intention, was to use this. And when you look at the back of the connector, I'm not going to show you in the car because it's hard to see, but we can look at this boom sling harness. When you actually find 68B, there's no wire coming out of it, and it looks like it's almost sealed shut. So I'm not sure how you'd add another pin into here. So I would not recommend using 68B. I'd recommend using pin 72B, which is the rear O2 sensor heater ground. It's available for a switched output. So that's what I'm going to be using. So I've ran a wire from the other side of this relay. So there's my power in, there's my power out that goes to the fuel pump. One of them is the blue with orange wire that would bring power to the controller. And this green wire that you can see running here goes all the way up to the ECU. And I've got it sticking out somewhere down there, and I'm gonna do just like I mentioned doing for the wideband controller. I'm gonna find that rear O2 sensor wire. I'm gonna cut it back a little bit, and I'm gonna tie in that green wire that I ran up to the front. Here's the green wire right here. That way, when I turn the ignition on, I can have AEM prime the fuel pumps. They'll run for 2 seconds, and then they'll turn off, versus doing it how I had it before, where they'd run when the key is on. So if you're sitting in your car with the key on and it wasn't started, both of your fuel pumps would be running. So that about covers it. I think I went over everything. So let me know if you guys have any questions or what you think of the video. Thanks.